Welcome to the third session of our online seminar. In this section, we'll take a deeper dive into some of the sources and how they can help answer genealogical questions, and we'll also say a few words about using DNA in family history research. Once again, our instructor for this session is Ann Lawthers, genealogist at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. She assists NEHGS library visitors with their family history research, both on-site and online, and her areas of interest include New England and New York, the Mid-Atlantic, Ireland, Eastern Canada, and migration patterns. Welcome back, Ann Lawthers.
Thank you. Now that you have all been introduced to the basic principles of genealogical research and also the key sources of genealogical records, how do you go about finding those records? As I've said before, records vary by state and by time period. And because most of us don't have a photographic memory, we rely on a network of finding aids to locate what we need. After discussing the finding aids, I'll cover some helpful problem-solving technique, and then I'll conclude with an introduction to using DNA for genealogical research. Okay. Most of you probably have this book in your library. The Red Book is organized by state, and for each state, it provides a brief history of that state, such as when it was admitted to the Union, a little bit about some of its major features, and then the book provides an overview of major record sources in each state. You will probably become familiar with sources in your area, but when you are confronted with a new area, you might want to take a look at what's available through the Red Book. And conveniently, it's online at Roots Web. Now, if you want to know more about a specific source, you go to the source. This book is organized by record type. So you have a chapter on census records, you have a chapter on vital records, and in addition, there are special topics such as African American research, Jewish American research, and Native American research. This also is online at Roots Web. State guides are absolutely indispensable when tackling research for a specific state. These are two guides that we frequently use here at the library and are essential for New England and New York State research. As I mentioned last time, it's important to know at which governmental level a record sits. And for the New England states, that varies. Vital records in all the New England states were originally collected by the towns, that's birth, marriage, and death, collected by the towns, and gradually over time, that responsibility shifted to the state level. Now, things get interesting when you are looking for land or probate records, because some of the states keep their records at the town level, such as Rhode Island and Connecticut and Vermont for land. But the other states keep the land records by county. So if you're looking, say, for the county of Washington in Rhode Island and you're not finding anything, it's for a land record, it's because it's on the town level. Same thing with probate records, it varies by state. Let's take a closer look at the New England Guide. This is a page from the main guide, and it shows where you would go for the probate records, And as I mentioned earlier, probate in Maine is recorded on the county level. So this page gives you information about addresses and telephone numbers. But what I use the guide for most often are what I'm showing you here and what I will show you on the next slide. For each state, there is an alphabetical listing of towns, and the town tables include very valuable information such as the date they were incorporated, aka the beginning of record keeping. So up here in Maine, we've got Abbott, Maine was incorporated in 1827. So you can expect records for Abbott, Maine would begin about that time. It gives you the county that they're located in, and if applicable, whether or not it was carved out of another town, whether it has a parent town, and whether it itself was chopped up to become another town, a daughter town. The notes usually reflect when the town was actually settled and whether or not it had a different name at some point. Then the last two columns on this page are where you go looking for vital records and where you go looking for church records. Okay, the map pages are the other page that I most frequently use from the New England Guide. It is definitely one of my favorite features because you can visually determine whether or not the town of your second great-grandmother was next door to the town of your second great-grandfather. It's really helpful to answer the question, does it make sense that I'm finding a vital record here, down at the bottom of this particular page, and then a few years later, a vital record up here. So even though I've lived in Massachusetts for over 50 years, I certainly don't have a map of the state in my head. And I find these county-specific maps in the New England Guide very, very helpful. Now, not every state has a guide such as the New York Guide or the New England Guide, but do not despair. There are family search research wikis. These research wikis are short articles about record availability, and I find them very helpful because they also identify any record loss in a particular town. The banner on the right-hand side of this slide shows the wiki topics that are available for the state of Virginia. It talks about beginning research, and then it identifies by specific record types what's available for the state of Virginia. I'm going to talk more about this particular resource in just a moment. The map of the U.S. is a second online research tool that I find indispensable. Okay, to get to the Family Search Research Wiki, you go to their main page, hover over the word search, and then at the bottom, you find the word Research Wiki. Click on that. At the next page, you can either click on the map, or you can click in the box and type in what you're searching for, whether it be a place or a topic or whatever. So here we have an example from Poland Genealogy, one of the wiki pages. We have a Vermont page, another location-specific page. We have a topic, U.S. migration canals. And finally, the Great Valley Road. So this gives you an example of the types of articles that are in the Family Search Research Wiki. It's a great online finding aid. Now, this is the Map of US site. It's mapofus.org. When you get there, you're going to click on US Maps. I then clicked on North Carolina, and up came the North Carolina map. This shows the changes of county boundaries between 1664 and 1965. So North Carolina has had a lot of county boundary changes. Your ancestors may have lived in the same farmhouse for 50 years, but lived in 3 or 4 different counties. This will help you tease that out. So by 1752, there were a few more counties in North Carolina, but still doesn't look like the North Carolina that we know today. And then in 1812, there are still more counties. You can see when you compare the different views, which counties have split. Of course, they also include helpful notes with the state map. But I do find this particular resource invaluable for understanding whether or not county boundaries have changed. Okay, town and county histories. I talked about these last session. Many of these are available online. They're great finding aids. Any book that was published before about 1920 is fair game to be online. And in your handout, I've listed some of the places that you can go to find these online county histories. As I said earlier, they frequently identify the first settlers and where those settlers came from. And the first churches are almost always mentioned, which is helpful if you're searching for one of the very earliest settlers and you want to know where they went to church. So where do I go looking for the record? And many town and county histories include complete rosters of the Revolutionary and Civil War soldiers who came from the particular town. Okay, so now we know what sources are that genealogists use. We have a sense of how to go find those sources with the help of finding aids. Now we're going to move on to problem solving. Problem solving is about matching a specific record to the question that the patron is asking. Answering some questions is relatively straightforward, others not so much. If you are looking for a birth date and place, your record of choice would be a vital record. Now, some of you might say, but census, I can find out from the census. Not really. You can find out a person's age and therefore infer a birth year. And you can also at least identify the state from the later census records. But vital records is really your first go-to source for a birth date and place. Country of foreign birth, naturalization records, vital records, census. Death date, again, vital records. Probate records most often will not list the precise death date, but the date of probate is usually within about 3 months of a person's death date, because early on, that's how frequently the courts met. And if none of these, vital records, cemetery, probate records, or newspapers, turn up anything, you would go to Bible records and military records. So for a foreign birth location, lots of places you can try to find the answer to the question. If you're looking for an immigration date, the census, surprisingly, is one of your first sources that you might go to. Then you might try the passenger list and the naturalization records. For a maiden name, you want to go to a vital record, but other places that sometimes have maiden names are cemeteries. Have you ever seen a tombstone with a person's maiden name on it? Maud Bell Plowman, my ancestor. There it is on her tombstone. Actually, all of her names. Maud Houston Bell Plowman is on her tombstone. Military records, because if a widow is claiming a pension, she has to prove the marriage, and the maiden name would be available then. If your patron is looking for parents' names, obviously vital records, but keep in mind that if the person is looking for parent names back in the colonial time period, the vital records may not mention the name. You're more likely to get a colonial parent name from a probate record or even a newspaper, or certainly a published genealogy. And if you want to know where people lived, census, great tool. Land records, local histories. But then if all of those fail, look for military records, look at taxation records, and look for obituaries. Let's take a deeper dive into the census. I think the census is a great multi-purpose tool. I'm going to show you how to use the census to identify a migration pattern, how to use the census to find out where to look for a record, and even how to use the census to identify parents or the date of arrival in America. Okay, the Percival family. Stephen Percival was born in 1818 in New York, and he was a minister. He married Roxana in Vermont, and they had many children. Their oldest son was born in 1839 in Vermont. Their youngest child was born in 1869 in Nebraska. Now, how do you use all this information? By the way, this was not a single census. This was multiple U.S. censuses. So on this slide, I've plotted out in a timeline fashion the birth dates of the children and where they were born. So we see that Alonzo and Edgar were born in Vermont. So where do we look for their birth records? We're going to look in Vermont. Philo, Stephen, and DeWitt, or at least Philo and Stephen, and Judson were born in New York State. Where do we look for their record? New York, although we probably won't find it. In Michigan, we have DeWitt being born as well as Elmer. Now, at some point, Alonzo is going to be ready to get married. So he might have gotten married around 1858. Where was the family in 1858? They were in Illinois. So where might I look for a marriage record for Alonzo? I would look in Illinois. So knowing the migration pattern of the family and knowing where they lived gives you a clue as to where to look for records. Now, if you are looking for the parents of an ancestor who was born after 1840, you might just find clues in the U.S. federal census. So in 1930, Virginia and Robert Lawthers are living in Belmont, Massachusetts with their 3 sons, the oldest of whom is 8. Now, if I didn't already know the parents of Robert Lawthers, I could use the census to try to figure that out. Since their oldest child is 8, they probably got married around 1920 or 1921. Their oldest child was born in 1922. Likely, Robert was living with his birth family in 1920, probably in Massachusetts. I did a search for Robert Lawthers of Massachusetts, and lo and behold, there were only 2 hits, one for Cambridge and one for Plymouth. Now, I didn't have to use that book, the New England book and the maps, but Cambridge is quite close to Belmont. So I am betting that the family in Cambridge is the birth family of Robert Lawthers, and yes, it is. So you can use the census to identify possible parents, which you can then verify through other tools. And determining when your ancestor arrived. You can determine that from the census. The 1900, 1910, 1920 censuses include information about date of arrival. So here we see that the heading for citizenship says column 13 is the year of immigration. Column 14 is whether or not the person is naturalized or an alien. And column 15 is, if naturalized, what year? Gold mine. So here we have James Lawthers, and James Lawthers arrived in 1890. He is naturalized, and from this census, we know that he naturalized in 1910. The 1920 census is the only one that gives the year of naturalization if they are naturalized, but it's great. Let's take a deeper dive into newspapers. First of all, newspapers provide a snapshot of history on the day they were published. Most frequently, genealogists think of using newspapers for obituaries. Although, if you are looking for a death that occurred prior to 1890, you usually find only a death notice rather than a full obituary. But sometimes that's better than nothing. You can also find marriage and birth notices, even going back to 1800s. And it really depends on where the newspaper is being published about the level in society that gets these marriage and birth notices. We tend to think of early 1800s marriage and birth notices as perhaps being something from the upper strata. Not so if you're living in Maine. They've got marriage and birth notices going back to 1810 for very ordinary people. So it depends on your location. Another really cool thing about newspapers is family news. For decades, newspapers ran notices about who was visiting whom. Mrs. Jones is visiting her daughter, Mrs. Smith, and staying for a week. So you can find out who's visiting whom about your family. Now, the 2 things that I want to call your attention to are advertisements and legal notices. If you have an ancestor who was a mariner, do check out the seaport newspapers and their advertisements of what ships arrived and what those ships were carrying. This is for the Port of Boston, and it talks about the format for these is the arrival of the brig Clarissa, that's the name of the ship. Perkins is the name of the captain. And the home base for this particular brig is Kennebunk Port in Maine. And it came from, went to New Orleans, and then, and it came from New Orleans on the 23rd. And then we have more ships. The Belize is a ship arriving on the 29th of March. So these notices, some of them even have what they are carrying, a load of molasses, for example. So do look at ship arrivals if your ancestor was a mariner. And legal notices. This is from 1800, and it is talking about letters of administration on the personal estate of Levin Sotheron, late of Charles County, deceased. And the notice is asking anyone who has claims against this individual to please make them known to the executor. So legal notices sometimes give you clues about deaths even before you find something in a vital record. Where are you going to find newspaper collections? Ideally, we would all love to have free access to newspaper collections, but it doesn't work that way. Some of the more useful subscription collections includes early American newspapers, which goes all the way back to 1690. And it's a redx.com publication. I have found materials back into the 1750s for Maine in those newspapers. They are fascinating reading. Then we've got newspapers.com, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. The publisher's extra portion of newspapers.com is for individuals only. Libraries cannot subscribe to the publisher's extra, which is too bad because publisher's extra is the best place for obituaries. It is unfortunate. And then Genealogy Bank. Now, all of these have slightly different coverage. So if you don't find a newspaper for the area that you are interested in one database, do try another. And there are many free databases. I've given you URLs in your handout. One is called Elefind. There's the Library of Congress, of course, chronicling America. There's Old Fulton, New York Postcards, which is a quirky website. Fortunately, about 2 years ago, someone came up with a user-friendly search engine of that database. And that's what I've supplied to you in your handout. But the Old Fulton website has a phenomenal collection of New York State newspapers. And sometimes those vital records that you can't find in New York, you can find them in the Old Fulton collection of newspapers. Two other free sources are Advantage Archives and Google News Archives. Okay, let's move on to an introduction to DNA. So what is DNA? At its most basic level, DNA is the genetic building material in all our cells. It's the instructions that tell our cells how to perform. In the nucleus of the cell, there are 22 chromosome pairs. These are known as autosomes. And of course, you have one pair, which is the XX or XY pair. Mitochondrial cells are cells outside the nucleus that convert food into energy that a cell can use. So here's a picture. You've got the nucleus, this blue blob of the cell, and you've got the mitochondria, which are outside the nucleus in the cytoplasm outside the nucleus. And these are the major pieces that are tested when our DNA is evaluated. There are three basic tests, DNA tests. The autosomal DNA test reports on a person's racial or ethnic background. It evaluates the DNA in the 22 autosomal pairs. So it's the DNA that you get from both your mother and your father. It's also the least expensive of the DNA tests, ranging from about $50 to $90, depending on discounts. The autosomal testing can also suggest people who might be cousins, and the key word here is might. Autosomal testing cannot tell you with 100% accuracy whether or not someone is a cousin. Y-DNA reports on a person's male ancestors. The test is more expensive. It ranges from about 120 to 450 or even 700, depending on the number of strands that are tested. And then we have MT, or mitochondrial DNA, which reports a person's ancestry through their female ancestors. Now, all cells have mitochondria, and its characteristics are passed on from the mother to the children of both male and female, but only the daughters can continue passing it down. Some terms that you will become familiar with. You will hear genetic distance. Genetic distance is most often referred to in terms of a Y-DNA test. Y-DNA changes or mutates less rapidly than other types of DNA. So the genetic distance is the number of mutations between the matches. It's not a direct measure of how many generations. So if you have a genetic distance of 2, it's not talking about 2 generations back. It's talking about how many changes separate you and a particular match. Now, you will hear segments. That's a section of DNA on a chromosome. You will also hear centimorgans, which is a unit measuring the length of a piece of DNA. And a match is the length in centimorgans on a segment that is shared with another test taker. DNA testing is not a magic bullet, but it can do some very useful things. It can test a hypothesis about ancestry that you might have. It can confirm a matrilineal or patrilineal line of origin. If you are adopted, it can provide possibilities of recent non-paternity events. And non-paternity events is when the mother's husband is not the father of the child. And it can definitely open up a can of worms. What DNA cannot do is solve a brick wall without genealogical research. It will not hand you an answer on a platter. It also cannot determine a Native American tribe. Now, autosomal DNA can give you clues about Native American ancestry, but by the time you get back to your second great-grandparents, the amount of DNA that you've inherited is quite dilute. So the native princess story is probably not going to be confirmed. DNA also cannot be proof positive. Now, on the autosomal test, it includes SNPs or pieces. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. It takes little snips of all the 22 autosomal chromosomes, plus the X chromosome. It does not include the Y chromosome. Each testing company takes about 700,000 SNPs of the DNA. In this diagram, the genetic material inherited has been colorized and makes the point that we get 50% of each parent's DNA, on average about 25% of the grandparents, 12.5% of our great-grandparents, and on back, so that for the top row, we have 1.5%, we, the person down here, down at the bottom of the diagram, has 1.5% of the DNA from a person in the top row. That's pretty dilute. So you're not going to have a definitive answer the further you go back. Autosomal testing is great for identifying potential cousins. These potential cousins may have done more bricks and mortar or paper research than you have, and they may provide clues that you have not seen or didn't know about. Autosomal DNA is also great for determining which chromosomes and which pieces of a chromosome you get from mom and dad, if your parents also provide a DNA sample. The autosomal will tell you ethnic origin to some degree, although each testing company uses a different referent pool, so you will potentially get different ethnic estimates depending on the company you test with. And if you are interested in information up to 5 or 6 generations back, the autosomal test is for you. The standard Y-DNA tests compares STRs, or short tandem repeats, or also known as markers, on the Y chromosome. These markers change relatively slowly over time, making them ideal to trace lineages further back in time. Y-DNA is passed down directly from father to son. So you would use Y-DNA for researching your paternal ancestry. It is what is used for one-name study projects. You might want to use Y-DNA to compare male immigrants to the New World, because the Y-DNA allows you to go much further back than 5 or 6 generations. Analogous to the Y-DNA in some respects is the mitochondrial test. Now, the mitochondria, which are outside the nucleus, don't have a lot of DNA, but they do have enough that can be extracted and tested. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited from mother to child. Now, males do inherit mtDNA, but they don't pass it on to their children. Only women can pass on mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA testing is best for researching your maternal ancestry, comparing to see if two people have the same mother or maternal grandmother, and comparing female immigrants to the New World. It also allows you to very much focus in on your ethnic estimates. But before you test, you need to define your goals. If your goal in taking a DNA test is to learn about your ethnic origins, go with an autosomal. If you want to connect with possible genetic cousins, take the autosomal. Connect with a biological family if you are an adoptee, autosomal. Identify the father of a recent male ancestor within 5 generations. You would do both an autosomal and a Y-DNA test. To identify the father of an historic male ancestor more than 5 generations back, you have to do a Y-DNA. If you want to identify the mother of a recent female ancestor within 5 generations, you're going to want to do both the autosomal and the mitochondrial test. Now, to identify the mother of an historic female ancestor, mitochondrial test only. Now, one company, 23andMe, focuses on certain health conditions. So you would take an autosomal test with them. Who offers the various tests? Well, the autosomal test is offered by Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Living DNA, which includes limited Y-DNA and mitochondrial testing. The Y-DNA test is only offered by Family Tree DNA. Same with the mitochondrial test, only Family Tree DNA. Tip: test with several companies. You will, because each company has a different referent pool and each company has a different pool of test takers, you're going to end up with some differences between the tests, and that can be very valuable information for you in your search for answers. Okay, then in summary for this session, finding aids will help you learn about record availability by location and time period so that you can make your searching more focused. Census is an all-purpose tool that can address many genealogical questions, so it really bears a second and sometimes third look. Vital records provide you the important clues of kinship. And for DNA testing, you need to identify your goals. Why are you doing this? What are you hoping to get out of your DNA test? And then test with more than one company. I thank you very much for listening in to this segment. For additional information, I'd like to recommend that you go to americanancestors.org/education for recent listings of webinars, educational offerings, for our complete list of subject guides and archived webinars. Thank you very much.